Do you have the courage to stand? Boldness and courage are truly in short supply in our world today. And perhaps that's because righteousness is in short supply in our world today. In Proverbs chapter 28 and verse 1, Solomon writes, "The wicked flee when no man pursues, but the righteous are as bold as a lion." Perhaps the reason we don't have much courage in our world today is because we don't have much righteousness. The wicked are cowardly. Oh, they may be bullies. They may act tough. But when it really comes down to it, they have no moral courage and they have no real courage. In 1 John 4 and verse 17, John says, "Herein is our love made perfect, that we may have boldness in the day of judgment, because as he is, so are we in this world." We need courage and boldness to stand. We need courage and boldness to stand for righteousness, to stand for what is right. In 2 Chronicles chapter 15 and verses 7 and 8, there the prophet says, "Be ye strong therefore." He's talking to the king of Judah, Asa. And he says, "Be ye strong therefore, and let not your hands be weak, for your work shall be rewarded." And when Asa heard these words and the prophecy of Obed the prophet, he took courage, and he put away the abominable idols out of all the land of Judah and Benjamin, and out of the cities he had taken from Mount Ephraim. He renewed the altar of the Lord that was before the porch of the Lord. He just needed someone to encourage him, to give him the courage to do what he knew needed to be done. He was the king. He had the power already. He had the authority already, but he needed someone to tell him, "Go do it. Go do what needs to be done. Be strong. God will reward your work if you're doing what is right." And he took courage, and he did what was right. Story is told of years ago, Brother B.M. Lemons from around Mammoth Springs, Arkansas. He was holding a meeting, and a woman approached him and said he better not come back the next night, because she would be waiting at the creek with a gun to shoot him if he came back to preach that meeting the next night. Well, they were disturbed by this, and his family hated to see him right off the next night, but they said, "I've got to go. I can't let her stop me." And so the time came, and sure enough, there she was at the creek, sitting on her horse with the gun in her lap. And he rode up to the creek, rode into the creek, went right past her, and never stopped, because he knew he had to preach the gospel. On another occasion, Sterl Watson had a woman come forward at a meeting, and she wanted to be baptized, and so he was going to baptize her. Well, the woman's husband said, "I'm going to be down there at that creek when you get over there, and I'll shoot you if you baptize my wife." Well, sure enough, when they got there he was with his gun on the other side of the creek. Someone asked him later what he did. He said, "Well, we walked off into the water, and I baptized her. And the man who had made the threat didn't do anything about it." As a footnote to that story, a couple of weeks later, that man was baptized as well. He respected that courage and recognized it for what it truly was. We need courage and boldness to stand for righteousness. But we also need courage and boldness to stand against sin. There is a difference. It may seem like semantics, but there really is a difference in standing for doing what's right and standing against what is sin. And we need to stand against sin, and we need the courage to do that. In Exodus 23 and verse 2, Moses commanded the children of Israel, "You shall not follow a multitude to go do evil. Neither shall you speak in a cause to twist judgment or justice." You don't go follow a crowd just because it's the crowd, just because it's the majority. You don't follow them and go do something evil. There are many in our world today who are doing that very thing. They are following the crowd. They're not standing up. They're not speaking up. They're not saying anything against the sin and the evil in our world. They're just going along with it, keeping their mouth shut. And they say, well, I'm not participating in that. I'm living my life right. I'm not doing those sinful things. But they're not speaking up against it either. During the time of Adolf Hitler in Germany, there was a rabbi of the Jewish community that said he had learned many things. And he said, "The most important thing I learned under those tragic circumstances is that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problem. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, the most tragic problem is silence." Many years before, Edmund Burke had said the same thing when he warned, "All that is necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing." We've got to stand against sin. It's good to stand for righteousness, but we also have to stand against sin. Stand up for what's right, stand against what's wrong, and let it be known where we stand. And it takes courage to speak up and say that, especially when there's a crowd around you all hollering the opposite thing, when you're outnumbered. And many times when it comes to sin, we're outnumbered. There are many more sinful in the world than there are that are trying to do what is right. Heard recently this week, in fact, I didn't realize that it hadn't been done years ago, but they said in the state of New York, it's now no longer a crime to commit adultery. I thought they'd done away with that years ago, but apparently it was still on the books, that it was actually illegal to commit adultery. Not anymore. They struck it down. They said, no, that's not bad. It's not worthy of being called even, it was just a misdemeanor anyway. It wasn't a felony. It's just a misdemeanor. And now they said, no, not even that. To commit adultery, not even a crime anymore. And we have to be able to stand up against sin and speak out against sin, even contrary to those in authority. Sometimes we might speak up to our neighbor or a relative, but boy, we would never speak out before some governing official. But Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 23 says, "By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hid by his parents 3 months because they saw he was a proper child, and they were not afraid of the king's commandments." The king had commanded that all of the baby boys of the Jews be thrown into the river and drowned. But Moses' parents, they weren't afraid of the king's commandment. They had faith in God. And so they hid their son for 3 months, contrary to that commandment. Imagine how hard it is to hide a baby. Babies are loud. They cry a lot. And yet, they were able to hide him for 3 months. And then we need courage and boldness to stand with others who are doing right. When we see somebody else stand, we need to stand with them. We need to encourage them. In Numbers chapter 14 and verses 6 through 9, Joshua the son of Nun and Caleb the son of Jephunneh were of those that searched the land, and they tore their clothes, and they spoke to all the company of the children of Israel, saying, the land which we passed through to search it, it is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, then he will bring us into the land and give it to us, a land flowing with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord. Neither fear the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their defense is departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. It's interesting, as you read that entire section, what you find is, at first, Caleb stood up and spoke up alone. And then Joshua joined in with him. Joshua stood with him, and they spoke together. Now, in this case, of course, they struggled mightily anyway because the rest were against them. But those two stood together. The whole group, the whole company of the children of Israel was ready to stone them to death for it, and would have if God had not intervened, but they stood together nonetheless. They were not afraid to stand up and say, we can go take that land. We can go do what God told us to do. Sometimes, kind of like King Asa, someone needs someone to stand with them. Someone needs some encouragement. Do you remember Barak in Judges? And he was told to go and fight for the Lord. And he said, well, the only way I'll go, Deborah, is if you go with me. Well, she wasn't much of a warrior, but he wanted her moral support, I guess. He wanted her to be with him. And she said, okay, I'll go with you. But she said, you're not going to get the victory then. The victory is going to be by a woman. And sure enough, Jael was the one that actually killed the captain of the enemy army. But we need to stand with others who are doing right. And Acts chapter 28 and verses 14 and 15. As Paul was on his way toward Rome, he'd been arrested and he was being sent to Rome. He had said, I appeal to Caesar. And so they said, okay, you're going to Caesar. And he was on his way there. As they were on the way to Rome, he said, when the brethren heard of us, in verse 15, they came to meet us as far as Appii-forum and the 3 taverns. And when Paul saw them, he thanked God and took courage. You can get courage from others standing with you, even if it's, these people weren't going to Rome with him. They weren't going to stand trial with him, but just them coming to see him as he was on his way to that trial was an encouragement to him. I can't think how many times I've been to visit somebody in the hospital who was about to go in for surgery, and how much courage somebody gets from having somebody come visit them and pray with them before they go under the knife. It can be a frightening thing, and people can be very scared, but just something about just having somebody else there. I think that was one of the most difficult things that during the time of COVID, when they would not allow any family member in the room with the patients, many of whom were on their way to death. And they had to face that alone. They couldn't have anybody there to hold their hand. They couldn't have anybody there to speak words of comfort to them as they were facing their final minutes. That was one of the most difficult things of that entire time, was that people had to face that alone. It's a frightening thing to face death alone. It's a frightening thing to face a lot of life's challenges alone. I remember when my son was born and there were some complications, and Don was in the hospital and he was in the hospital and I was there, and I had called my parents and talked to them, and they drove to where we were. And I wasn't alone. I had my son, I had my wife. She was asleep and he was there, but I was scared. I was a new parent and I was scared. And when my parents walked through that door, the courage it gave me, nothing had really changed. No, none of the circumstances had really changed, but just knowing there was somebody else there, that I wasn't facing that alone anymore. What a great bit of courage it can give to be with someone, to stand with them. And we have to have the courage and boldness to stand even in the minority. And we talked about the passage in Exodus that said, don't follow a multitude to do evil. In Numbers 13 and verse 30, Caleb, he was in the minority for sure. He and Joshua, 2 people out of over 600,000 men, were saying, let us go up at once and possess it. We are well able to overcome it. The courage to stand and say that, and he was the only one saying it at that point. Joshua then joined him. Moses, of course, was on his side, but he knew God was on his side. And God is always in the majority. Sometimes we feel like we're in the minority, and if you take God out of the equation, you might be. But if you are on God's side, you're in the majority. Even though you may be outnumbered by human beings 1,000 to 1. God is always the majority. But we need to beware of the discouragement that we give when we speak against others. Somebody that's trying to be courageous, that's trying to stand up. And if we say the wrong things, realize that we can discourage as well as we could encourage. A group of frogs were traveling through the woods, and 2 of them fell into a deep pit. All the other frogs gathered around the pit, and when they saw how deep the pit was, they told the 2 frogs they were as good as dead. 2 frogs ignored them and kept trying to jump out. The other frogs kept saying, just stop. You don't have any chance of getting out of there. And one of them finally gave up, and he fell down and died. The other frog just kept jumping as hard as he could, and he jumped, and he kept seeing the crowd of frogs yelling at him, and he just jumped harder and harder, and finally he made it out. And when he got out, the other frog said, what, didn't you hear us? We were telling you to give up and quit. Why didn't you quit? Well, the frog said, I was hard of hearing. I thought you were encouraging me to try harder. Well, sometimes we can take encouragement even when it's not necessarily intended. But we need to have the courage, even when we're in the minority, to keep trying and keep doing what is right. And then we need to realize that we need courage and boldness to stand in spite of suffering and even to the point of death. In Hebrews chapter 11 and verses 32 through 38, the writer of Hebrews lists several there. He says time would fail to tell of all these others, but he lists several of them. Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, David, Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith subdued kingdoms, worked righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped from the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the armies of the enemies. Women received their dead raised to life again. Others were tortured, not accepting deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. So he says some of them escaped the sword. Some of them turned other armies and made them flee, and they chased them. But he said there were some that were tortured, even to the point of death here. They didn't accept deliverance so that they could get a better resurrection. Others had trials of cruel mockings and scourgings, bonds and imprisonments. They were stoned. They were cut in half. They were tempted. They were killed with the sword. He says, but they were faithful. They were bold. They stood for God in spite of that. All the way to the point of death. We remember from history the story of Leonidas and the 300 Spartans. It's a story of courage, of standing your ground and fighting to the death, even against innumerable odds. He was warned by the Persians. The Persian envoy came to see him and urged him not to try to resist the Persian army. He said, "Our archers are so numerous that the flight of their arrows will darken the sun." And Leonidas said, "So much the better. We'll fight in the shade." Now, how much courage does it take to face those kind of odds and then to make a comment like that? Well, of course, they made their stand and they died. I'm sure they probably took out far more of the enemy than there were of them. But eventually they lost their lives. And there are some throughout the history of Christianity who have made their stand and have lost their lives because of it. We see even in the New Testament, of course, Jesus himself died on the cross. But even after his resurrection, we see James, the brother of John. We see Stephen. We see others. We see Paul arrested, and multiple times they tried to kill him. They stoned him. He was shipwrecked on occasion because he was trying to do what was right. Not that someone shipwrecked him, but he suffered those things. Peter was thrown in prison. Peter and John were beaten. They didn't let it stop them. They continued to stand courageously in spite of their suffering. And even to the point of death, Revelation 2:10, Jesus, through John, tells some of those early Christians, "Do not fear those things which you shall suffer. The devil shall cast some of you into prison, that you may be tried, and you will have tribulation 10 days. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life." Now that same commandment is given to us. Whether it's a violent death like some of them faced, or whether it's just a matter of death from old age or illness or whatever else, be faithful unto death. Whether it's your death brought on because you were faithful, or just your death comes because it's the inevitable end of all mankind, be faithful until that point. There's nothing sadder to me in the world than to see someone who was a Christian for 40 or 50 or 60 years, and then as they're getting to the end of their life, then they quit. You were almost there. Why would you quit at that point? You made it through the difficult times. You made it through those youthful lusts and all of the hardships of early parts of life. And now, when the finish line is in sight, then you're going to turn away and give up. Be faithful until death. All the way till that last step is taken. And then we need to realize that we need courage and boldness to stand at God's throne in prayer. And we can have that. In Hebrews chapter 4, verses 15 and 16, he says, "For we do not have a high priest which can't be touched with the feeling of our infirmities. He was in all points tempted like we are, yet without sin. Let us therefore come boldly to the throne of grace, that we may obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need." We need to constantly remember that when it comes to going to God in prayer, it's not like we're interrupting Him and we're coming to Him with something and bothering him, and it's our idea to approach him with this. He's the one who came up with the idea of prayer in the first place. He's the one that tells us, bring me your cares, your troubles. Come to me. He's the one that had the idea. We're not bothering him. We're not interrupting him. He wants us to come bring him these things. And so it is that we should come to him boldly, knowing he wants to hear from us. Sometimes we're like a reluctant telemarketer calling somebody thinking we're bothering them and they're going to be mad at us for calling, because most of us are mad when the telemarketers call, right? Can you imagine being a telemarketer? Anybody ever done that? Not a fun job, is it? Calling people that don't want to talk to you, and they yell at you. One of my coworkers, when the telemarketers call him, he cusses them out. That's their job. And they're getting cussed out for doing their job. But we don't like it. Nobody likes the telemarketers calling them. And sometimes we feel like that's what we're doing to God. We're bothering him. We're calling him. He's going to be mad at us. But no, he wants us to get on that phone to heaven and call him. Charles Spurgeon said, prayer pulls the rope below, and the great bell rings above in the ears of God. Some scarcely stir the bell, for they pray so languidly. Others give but an occasional pluck at the rope. But he who wins with heaven is the man who grasps the rope boldly and pulls continuously with all his might. And he's right about that. We need to pray without ceasing. Tug on that rope. Make sure God hears you. And it was his idea in the first place. But we also need to remember that we need courage and boldness to stand before God in judgment, which we all will one day. We saw that in 1 John 4:17. When our love is made perfect, we may have boldness in the day of judgment. When we love God and we know he loves us, and when our love is perfected for him and in him, then we can know that we can have boldness to stand before God. Luke 21 and verse 36, he says, watch therefore and pray always, that you may be accounted worthy to escape all the things that shall come to pass, and to stand before the Son of Man. As Christians, as followers of Jesus Christ, we need to look forward to that time when we'll get to stand before our Lord, knowing that Jesus himself will be our advocate. He'll be our defense attorney. As Satan accuses us before God and tries to make it look like we weren't God's people, Jesus will be defending us. Who better than to have the Son of God himself defending us? But we've got to be faithful to him. We can have the boldness to stand before God in judgment. In Romans 14:10, Paul says, why do you judge your brother? Why do you set your brother as nothing? For we shall all stand before the judgment seat of Christ. Be careful judging others. If you go in judging others, you might not have very much boldness when you stand before Christ on the judgment seat in that final day. We need to think about that. As we conclude, I want us to consider the life of Polycarp. He was a Christian in the early 2nd century, and about the middle of that century, he was arrested and brought to the arena where they put the Christians to death. As he entered the stadium, several of the Christians believed that they heard the voice from heaven say, be strong, Polycarp. Act like a man. Polycarp stood before the Roman proconsul. And the proconsul gave him one final chance. He said, just swear by Caesar and say, take away the atheists, as Christians were known then because they didn't worship all of the Roman gods, and I will let you go free. Well, Polycarp looked at the roaring crowds and pointed at them and said, take away these atheists. The proconsul said, if you will swear, I'll let you go. Reproach Christ. Polycarp turned to him and boldly said, 86 years I have served my king, and he has never done me wrong. How could I blaspheme my king who saved me? The proconsul urged him again, swear by the fortune of Caesar. And Polycarp said, since you vainly think that I will swear by the fortune of Caesar, as you say, and pretend not to know who I am, then listen carefully. I am a Christian. The proconsul said, I have wild beasts. I can throw you to them if you don't repent. Polycarp replied, call them, for we cannot repent from what is better to what is worse. It's noble to turn from what is evil to righteousness. The proconsul threatened Polycarp with fire. But he said, you threaten me with fire that burns an hour or so and is soon quenched. But you are ignorant of the fire of the coming judgment and eternal punishment stored up for the ungodly. Why do you delay? So finally, they sent a lion, and it said that the lion refused to eat him. So they set the fire around him. They tied him up to the pyre and set the fire. And even the fire would not harm him. And finally, the executioner stabbed him. And he died, bled to death. They threatened him with everything, but nothing would turn him against Christ. Those Christians in the early centuries, they had courage. Can we have that kind of courage to stand for what is right against such evil, against such threats? We haven't faced that kind of threat. We're like those that the New Testament writer writes to. He says, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding blood. We haven't had to resist evil to that point yet. But what if the day does come? Will we be ready? Will we have the boldness and courage to stand? If you're not a Christian today, then Satan's already winning. He has you in his grasp. Have the boldness and the courage to stand and come forward and say, I believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. I'm willing to repent of my sins, and I want to be baptized to rise and walk a new life with my sins forgiven as a child of God. It takes courage to do that too. At least there's no one standing there with a gun to stop you from doing that today. Make that decision today if you've not. If you're here and you are a Christian, but perhaps you haven't been standing for righteousness. Perhaps you haven't been standing against sin. Perhaps you haven't been encouraging others who are standing. Perhaps there's some other reason that you have not had the boldness or courage that you should have, and you need to respond to God's invitation. If there's any reason you need to respond, please do so as we stand and as we sing.
Would you be free from the burden of sin?